Fabulous. Then I will get started. Last week we talked about the buyer representation and broker compensation form, the BRBC form. And then I talked about several forms that were attached to that form. Number one, we covered last week the forms that are physically attached to that form. You had your agency disclosure and you have your uh, consumer privacy protection addendum and buyer inspection advisory, those type of forms that are attached to that BRBC. This week we're covering the forms that are attached to it, but not the same way. These are ones that are mentioned in that form that might be referenced depending on what boxes you check and all of those things. So this one here, the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. This one, you might have several forms. Notice on the top, it has a number there that you can enter it in case their preferences and priorities change, which, as we all know, buyers' preferences and priorities do change. So here, this form is an optional form. I highly recommend using it only because this helps you to really identify what a buyer is looking for. Um, so here, top section, I'm doing really good today with my English. Parties and property, you're going to put in the buyer's names there, and then you're going to put in the brokerage name there, and then you would put here the date of their buyer representation agreement. So whatever was the date put on that BRBC, that's what goes in those lines. Here, then, right, buyer and broker agree that it is beneficial to both if buyer identifies in writing buyer's preferences and priorities for purchase of a property, although the information provided herein is only intended to represent a general expression of the buyer's needs, wants, and concerns as of the date signed below. Broker will use the information to narrow the parameter broker uses in searching for a property that might be acceptable to buyer. Buyer acknowledges that the buyer's preferences and priorities may change over time and that current housing inventory and other market conditions, as well as buyer's financial position, will determine how many of buyer's preferences and priorities can be achieved in acquiring property. Many buyers ultimately make compromises when choosing which properties to make offers on and acquire. It is buyer's responsibility to determine whether any property meets some or enough of buyer's preferences and priorities. Personally, I like this. I actually was involved in a lawsuit over buyers saying that the property they ended up buying didn't meet their preferences and priorities. Don't ask me why I was sued. It doesn't make sense, but that ultimately was what it came down to. So I like this form. I think that it's good. If nothing else, just paragraph 2 there that explains to the buyer that, hey, depending on your financial ability, like where you're at financially, you may have to make compromises. And ultimately, you're in charge of what properties meet your preferences and priorities. It's got a bunch of questions. I personally wouldn't hand this form to a buyer and say, fill it out. I would go over it with them as part of my buyer consultation and maybe just ask these questions and fill them out, right? So as part of that consultation, I'm going to ask, well, what price range are you looking in, right? I'm not going to say, here's 3A price range. I'm just going to make this conversational. Are you looking for a primary residence, right? Second home investment property? Are you looking for something that is income producing? Like, are you interested in like a duplex or a triplex? Did you know that you could buy up to a fourplex with an FHA loan as long as one unit's owner occupied? That could be a good way to get into, investment properties. Um, so many options. So property types, right? Are you interested in condos? Are you thinking just single family residences, right? What's the minimum number of bedrooms that you have? Minimum number of bathrooms? In that bedrooms question, that's a good one because sometimes people are like, oh, I need 4 bedrooms. And when you really drill down on it, they're like, well, I need 3 bedrooms and like an office space or a bonus space because we do homeschool or I work from home, right? So they need something like that. So they may not need total bedrooms because more of our newer homes now have bonus spaces. Right? Do they have a preference on how many stories the home has, their yard, solar, school district, access or disability features, cities, counties, and anything else, right? Do they want a pool? Do they want, right? So all those things can get asked as part of this form. Again, we don't have to like go line for line. We can just conversationally have this conversation with them about what it is that they're looking for and then check the boxes as it applies or fill this form out. Once they have this filled out, then it's, does this match what you're looking for? Yep, it does. Perfect. To go ahead and sign here, right? And then we've got it in writing what they're looking for. Keep in mind here for confidentiality, the preferences and priorities identified herein are intended as confidential information, as that term is defined in civil code, regardless of agency relationship in any transaction involving buyer and broker. These preferences and priorities will not be disclosed to any seller or seller's agent except as buyer authorizes broker, right? And then identification and changes to preferences and priorities. Buyer represents that buyer is not aware of any other significant preferences and priorities affecting buyer's effort to acquire property. Buyer has not made any verbal representations to broker of additional preferences or priorities. Buyer agrees to notify broker in writing of any changes. And then you sign below. So I like this form. It just kind of outlines it, sets you up. That way, if they're like, oh, it's got to have a pool, and then they're like, hey, Amy, we want to go see this house, and it doesn't have a pool, then you can be like, hey, remember on your list when we talked about your preferences and priorities, you said pool was something that was a priority to you, and this home does not have a pool. Is that something you're willing to compromise on? In fact, this home doesn't even have a lot that's pool size. Like you couldn't put one in later on. Are you okay with that? Right? So we can ask that question to narrow down the properties that we're actually physically going to go see. This gives us that launching pad to have that conversation with them of, hey, you said you needed 4 bedrooms. This one has 3. Or you said you not wanted 2,000 square feet. This one's only 1,500 square feet. So we can have those conversations. So buyer preference and priority, I like to mark the box on the BRBC to include this. And then I do it as part of my buyer consultation. Any questions about this form? The BIPP.
No.
Fabulous. All right, moving right along, we have our buyer financial and personal information form. This is our BFPI. This one is required, although I don't think most people are still using it. This one is required as part of the BRBC. The only option is, are we giving it to, is the buyer giving it to us immediately, or the default is 3 days after they sign? I think it's 3 days, could be 5, after they sign the BRBC. Okay, and this is a good form as well. Here, paragraph 2 again, paragraph 1 looks the same as the last one. Paragraph 2, buyer's financial and personal information. Buyer and broker agree that it is beneficial if both to both if buyer identifies in writing buyer's financial condition and personal information that broker can use in assessing and identifying properties that may be satisfactory to buyer. If buyer does not qualify to purchase the type of property for which the buyer is interested, buyer and broker may mutually alter the terms of the representation agreement, or broker may cancel that agreement. So here is, hey, how much deposit do you have available? This is a really good conversation to have up front with our buyers during our buyer consultation, because sometimes we assume they have money available. They're borrowing down payment from retirement funds. We go, hey, we need the deposit. And normally it's, let's say 1%. And this is a $600,000 home. That's $6,000. And they're like, oh my gosh, I don't have that kind of liquid funds available, especially if I've got to pay for inspections and appraisals and all these things and get ready to move. Like, I don't got cash available. It's all coming out of my retirement account, right? So let's have that conversation up front so we know what's available for deposit, or we can put the whole thing on hold until they can access some funds for that deposit. Amount of down payment available. Where's that down payment and deposit coming from, right? Is it coming from your savings, retirement account, gift, loan assistance program, sale of existing property, right? All those things. Source of additional funds, maximum loan amount, right? And remember, maximum loan amount isn't purchase price. This is loan amount. So they might have been pre-approved for 800,000, but they're like, hey, my comfort level is like 665,000 is the highest loan amount that I want to go to. And then I've got $100,000 on top of that, or $150,000 in down payment available, right? So we're going to add those two together. Lender information, are they pre-qualified, pre-approved, or fully underwritten? Now, if you get confused on what pre-qualified is versus pre-approved, when we go to the third box, which is fully underwritten pre-approval, we know that pre-approval and is where we want to be. Okay, so pre-qualified is, I I called a lender up and told them what I thought my FICO was and what my income was, and they told me I was pre-qualified to purchase a home. We don't want those buyers. Don't go show those buyers homes. Tell them they need to get pre-approved. A pre-approved buyer has taken their information. They've actually submitted it to a lender. The lender has pulled the credit. They've reviewed income and asset documentation. Like, they're pretty solid that we're going to get approved for a loan as long as nothing changes. So we like pre-approved. We don't like pre-qualified. So again, pre-qualified is I just gave information to a lender and they gave me a letter. Pre-approved is they've actually reviewed my information. Fully underwritten pre-approval, that one means that the lender actually took the information they received. They didn't just go over it, but they actually submitted it to the underwriter who has reviewed that package, and it's fully underwritten. We're just waiting for a house in order to be able to finalize that loan approval. So that's what those three mean. Financing type, conventional, FHA, VA, that's important, or other if they're doing like hard money or something. There, that's important because it will depend on what kind of house they can qualify for or what you're looking at. Let's see here. Are there any, let's see, note if buyer's preferred financing or lender does not allow buyer to pay for certain closing costs, including broker compensation, buyer will need to request that seller compensate buyer's broker. Maximum monthly housing expense. This is PITI HOA fees. That would be PITI stands for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So that is, hey, the max that we want to pay on a monthly basis for our whole housing payment, including our taxes and our insurance and our HOA fees, is X. Okay, that's a good question to ask because they're like, oh, max loan amount, that's $800,000. I've got $200,000 for a down payment, but my maximum monthly housing expense that I want to stay around is $5,600, right? Then we can go back to the lender and say, hey, lender, at 800,000 plus, so at $1 million, if our loan amount was 800 and we have 200 for a down payment, at $1 million, what's their payment going to be? And the lender's going to come back and be like, it's going to be $8,000. And you're going to be like, great, buyer. So you said max loan amount was 800,000, right? We can have this conversation with them, but your payment that you're comfortable with is going to be a purchase price closer to X, right? We can have that conversation with the lender. That way we make sure we're all on the same page. Are they doing a 1031 exchange? Are they expecting a legal settlement? Expected inheritance? Buyer intends to include a contingency to sell another property, right? We're getting all this information up front from our buyers so that we know exactly where we are and how we need to negotiate on moving forward, or how we need to inform them how to move forward. Current housing, do they own it? Do they rent it? Are they a first-time home buyer? How many homes have they previously purchased? Number of properties currently owned, real estate experience, right? Are they a licensed agent or broker someplace else? Are they a contractor or a real estate investor? Do they have a trade? Time constraints? Do they have a time frame in which they need to make sure they close on a property? What is their reason for the purchase, right? That's their why, so that we can redirect them back on their why when they start getting a little squirrely. And then any other information. And then again, this information is all confidential. We can't give this information to a seller, but this just helps us as we look to negotiate. And again, paragraph 7, again, is just, hey, this might change over time and we can modify it or change it as necessary. So this is the BFPI. Again, this actually is required per the BRBC as a purpose. Oh, you know what? I'm surprised. It used to, and maybe, oh, there we go. I skipped right over it. D. We went from sources and then additional funds. I skipped over D. I was like, it should be in here someplace. 3D, amount of additional funds available for broker compensation and closing costs. So we lump those all in there together. And that's a good conversation to have with your buyers as well. Sorry, I skipped that line because we have our down payment, we have our loan amount, and then we have closing costs. And closing costs are usually like 2 to 3% of the purchase price, unless it's a lower purchase price. So if it's like sub 400,000, then the closing costs are going to be higher than usually 2%, 2 or 3%, where it's going to be a little higher. And then the broker compensation, what did they put on the BRBC, and do they have those funds available? So this is an important place to have that conversation. Any questions about the BFPI form? Buyer Financial and Personal Information, BFPI.
Amy, actually, I was wondering why, if it's under 400,000, that the closing costs will be higher.
Yeah, absolutely. Because some closing costs are fixed. So we have like, or
Mm,
they're not necessarily based on purchase price. So what all counts as closing costs are things like your title insurance, your escrow fee, and the escrow fee is usually the same no matter whether it's a $400,000 purchase or a $1 million purchase. Your title insurance is kind of based on purchase price, but it's still one of those higher ones. So as the purchase price goes up, the ratio of title insurance cost to purchase price goes down. And as the purchase price is lower, that ratio is higher. And then things like your insurance. Oftentimes, like insurance is going to go up a little bit on the higher price points, but it's still expensive down here at the lower price points. And you usually pay for a whole year's worth of your insurance as part of the closing costs, and then you pay prorated interest and those types of things. So some of those fees, it doesn't adjust appropriately. Your lender's fees sometimes is more. You still are going to pay an appraisal fee, which is going to be the same at 400,000 as it is at 800,000. So a lot of those fees are kind of fixed fees, so it ends up being a higher percentage at those lower purchase prices. Does that make sense?
yes, absolutely. And one more question.
Yeah.
If, let's say, everything change, something changes and we need to, you know, take a look again at this form, do we do an addendum to this form, or do I give them this, or do we go over this form again and have them sign it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's a change to this, you could come back in here because it's between you and the buyer. You could come back in here and just actually cross it out. If they're like, "Oh, my maximum loan amount's
Okay.
800,000," and then we decided to change it and they're like, "Actually, we decided it's closer to 600,000 or we are going to increase it to 1 million," right? Whatever that is. You could actually cross it out, fill out the new one, then both you guys initial and date the change just so you had
Okay.
it. You could do an addendum. There is an addendum between you and the client, so the broker and the client addendum that you could use to modify this, or you could do the probably the best way would do a modification of terms or
Okay.
the MT form, MT-BR.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Anything else?
No.
Good questions. Thank you. All right. And on that note, our next form is the modification of terms for the buyer representation agreement, that MT-BR form. So this is where we would do buyer representation agreement. So this defaults to the BRBC or the PSRA when we want to make changes to either of those two agreements, or it does have another line. So you could say, hey, we're making a change to the BFPI here. Put in that, and then you're going to put the date on there. Now, notice on our BFPI form, it doesn't have a date at the top. Okay, we're just referencing the BRBC. So the date for this form, if we were going to make changes to it and we wanted to do that on the modification of terms, would be the date that it was signed. Okay, so just know that. Normally here on this date line, most of our regular forms, our buyer representation agreement, our purchase agreement, our listing agreement, they all have a printed date up here in the upper left-hand corner. And that would be the date that goes here. If it does not have a date, the form that we're referencing here, like if we were doing the BFPI, then we would do the date that it was signed. Um,
The date, I'm sorry the date that it originally was signed, or the day that the modification is being signed.
the date that it was originally signed. So we're going to make a
Perfect.
change
Okay.
to the original form. So we use that
Thank
date
you.
there. Yep. Expiration date, if we're changing this, we can use this to change the default of that expiration. So remember when we talked about the BRBC last week, we said it was good for 3 months. Okay, so we can extend that at any time during that 3 month period. You don't have to wait until the last day of that. We can extend it at any time, but at any time that we do extend it, like let's say that my BRBC expires in, I don't know, the 20th of June, and I'm being proactive and not waiting till the last date, I'm going to come in here. I can put in that, hey, we want it to go, today's the 11th. So I could say, hey, I want it to go June, July, August, September 11th. Okay. Because now the agreement can't last 3 months from the date of this modification. Okay,
Mm,
so even though the last one expired on the 20th, I couldn't go June, I couldn't go September 20th because that would be more than 3 months from today's date from the
gotcha.
modification. Okay, so just a little caveat there. We can change the compensation amount. So if you just decided you wanted to change the compensation, you have a couple of options here. So this first one is we're just changing the compensation. So on the BRBC was X. We've decided we're going to take Y for any property. We would put in that new amount here. And if we just wanted to change it for one property, we could check this box. So maybe we made an offer on a property. We asked, the buyer requested that we include as part of the offer that the seller's covering their portion of the compensation that's due to me. And that was X%. And sellers countered us back and said, hey, we're willing to accept your offer with these terms. And one of those is we're reducing the amount of compensation that you've asked for the seller to pay. And we know our buyer doesn't have any extra funds, or they're going to split the difference or whatever that might be. We can come in here and just change it for a specific property. So you would just come in here and put that address in here and put what that modification is. So here we would put the modification amount on the first line, and then you would check the box if it was just going to be for a specific property. If we don't check this box and fill anything else here, then it's for all properties moving forward from the date this document is signed. Okay. If we wanted to change the property type that they're looking for, the location, right? Change from non-exclusive to exclusive representation, we can check that box, or other. So if they're making changes to your BFPI, I would just come down here to other and fill out this information here. And I would put like BFPI 3D or whatever the reference is, and put, loan amount changed to max loan amount. I would probably use less words than what I just chose to. 800,000, right? So you can just go in there and make those changes. And then everybody signs it. So that's your modification. Most of the time, this is going to be used to modify the buyer representation agreement, but it can be used to change any of the other forms attached to that buyer representation agreement as well. Any questions?
No.
All right, fabulous. Our next form is our buyer material issues for a specific property. Again, we mentioned this one last week. It's mentioned in the buyer representation agreement. I believe it's also mentioned in the residential purchase agreement. I personally would give my buyers just a blank one of these at time that they sign the buyer representation agreement, and then I would give them a specific one once we entered into contract with the property address, APN number, all this information filled out. This form is puts the obligation on the buyer to disclose any information that they have regarding the property. If they've got questions or concerns, something's considered a material issue to them. This gives them a form to be able to put that on there. Why do I like this form? Number one, it talks about it. So we should be providing to buyer, if we're expecting them to read the forms, we should be providing to them the forms that are referenced in those documents that tell them they should use to be above board and use for their disclosure purposes. The secondary reason I like this is that, like, let's say my buyer has a question about the mark that was on the ceiling in the guest bathroom, right? And we looked at that and go, oh, that kind of looks like a water stain, but we're not an expert, so we're not going to say it's a water stain, or that kind of looks like mold. And the buyer has questions about it. Buyer can put their questions on here, like, hey, does the seller have any information about that discoloration or that stain looking mark on the ceiling in the guest bathroom? They can write that question out in this form. And now, instead of me taking what the buyer said on the phone to me and translating that to the listing agent, who's now going to translate it, right? It's a game of like phone that we used to play, back in elementary school, where you like drew on people's backs or said something in their ear, and then it went to like 4 or 5 people to see if it said the same at the end. It doesn't. It's never the same at the end. And so me translating what the buyer said to me to ask the seller and then translating that to the listing agent who's now going to translate it to the seller, who now the seller is going to respond to the listing agent who's now going to respond to me and then I've got to provide that back to the buyer. Like chances are something's going to get lost in translation. So this allows the buyer a form. They can write their question out to the seller. Hey, what's that spot about? Do you have any information regarding that? We just showed a house here that had like it looked like tar dripping down. It looked like sap dripping down in the attic on the walls. Right. So my buyer could have used this. Hey, there's some like black marks. It looks sticky. It's not up in the attic. Does the seller know what that is? Now I can take that form and give it to the listing agent who can give it to the seller. And now they've got the question directly from the buyer to the seller so that the seller can respond back to it, hopefully in writing. So we have the direct answer from the seller back to the buyer. So that's why I like this form. That was a really long way to explain it, but that's why I like this form is it gives my buyer a platform to list their concerns, their questions that they might have so that we can submit them directly to the seller instead of translating their questions. So that's why I like this form. And again, it's talked about in the buyer representation broker compensation agreement. It's also mentioned in the residential purchase agreement. I'm fairly confident it is. So I'd give them a blank form at time they signed the BRBC and then give them a blank or a form filled out with the property address once a property is under contract. Any questions about the BMI-SP form?
No.
Okay, fabulous. Moving right along. Next is the arbitration agreement. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. It talks about in the BRBC that if we have a disagreement between us and our buyers per our signed BRBC, we are supposed to do mediation, but we're not locked into arbitration. If you want to be locked into arbitration, you would have them sign this form as part of that BRBC. Why is that important? Well, on our purchase agreements, we sign an arbitration agreement clause. Everybody has to initial it or not agree to it if either everybody agrees to it or nobody agrees to it for it to be a valid contract. Mediation is when you sit down with somebody who is paid to be kind of the neutral party and facilitate a conversation between parties. That would be your mediator. That is something you are locked into with the purchase agreement or your BRBC or your listing agreement. They're all, you're supposed to go to mediation first before filing a lawsuit. As part of our purchase agreements, everybody usually agrees to the arbitration agreement. It's not part of the listing agreement. It's not part of the buyer representation agreement. So it really just goes between the listing agent and the buyer. Arbitration, the benefits and cons of arbitration are you can't just go file a massive lawsuit against somebody, generally speaking. You're required to go to arbitration. Arbitration is kind of like a lawsuit or like a court case. It's kind of like a court case, not a lawsuit. It's kind of like a court case. But instead of being heard in front of a jury of your peers, it's heard before a jury of real estate professionals who understand the industry and understand all the nuances in the contracts associated with that. So it gives it a little bit more specific pull on that. Why is that important? Because sometimes the nuances in contract law, especially when it comes to real estate contracts in the state of California, can get lost in a jury trial. So that's really the goal is with arbitration. It goes before a board of real estate professionals versus just a general board of peers, people who understand and know the contracts and know the law. So that would be arbitration. I wouldn't say I recommend this or don't recommend it. It's totally personal preference. Most people don't include this as part of their BRBC. It doesn't mean you shouldn't, but it's something that you probably do want to read through, look over, and decide whether or not you want to include this as part of your part of your BRBC or your listing agreements. All right. The next one is your additional agent acknowledgement, your AAA form. This is if we've got more than one agent working on a transaction. This just allows you guys to work and it doesn't matter who signs the form. It's good to go. So normally if I'm the agent listed on the residential purchase agreement or I'm the agent listed on the buyer representation agreement, even though the agreement is with the brokerage, um, the other agent on the other side, this really comes into play oftentimes once we write offers on the property. The agent on the other side is going to be like, hey, like, um, Christy signed it, and now I've got a signature from Amy, and I don't know who the actual agent is, but it said on the purchase agreement that it was Christy, so now I'm confused, right? So we're trying to alleviate that confusion. This also, if you have a team, this also allows you to make sure that you're both listed in like the MLS and you get credit for selling the property either on the listing side or the buyer side. So let's see here. You're going to check the box either A or B. So if we were filled out a buyer representation agreement, it would be 1B, which is multiple associate licensees are working with the buyer or tenant. If it was a listing agreement, it would be they're working with the seller or housing provider. You're going to put the brokerage name here. If you're on a team and you've got a team name, you'd put it there. And then here's where you would list all the agents, right? The licensees below and any licensees listed in the agreement, if not listed below, have entered into separate written agreements to share responsibility and compensation for certain real estate licensed activities. The licensees also have informed broker of or have given a broker a copy of a separate written agreement. And then you'd put names and license numbers of those that might act on the behalf. So then here 3 is all parties understand and acknowledge and agree that wherever the name of any licensee above is indicated in the agreement or related document as a representative for buyer or tenant or seller or housing provider specified above, the other licensees shall also be deemed to be named. Okay. If this form is being used to modify a buyer representation agreement, the seller doesn't need to sign. It would just be the buyer's signature and then the buyer's broker would sign. Okay. So that's how that goes. If it's on the purchase agreement, then everybody signs the form. So for listing agreement or buyer representation agreement, just the parties involved in that transaction, the brokerage and either the buyer or the seller sign the form. But then once we have a purchase agreement, if we have one of these forms indicated in the purchase agreement, then all the parties would sign. And it doesn't have to be 2, just so you know, you could list like 2 or 3 agents here. Only one of them has to sign down here. Okay. So just a heads up on that. So that's your additional agent acknowledgement form. And again, this usually comes into play if you're on a team or something to that effect. The other time this might come into play if you're getting ready to go on vacation and you're leaving your files to somebody else while you're on vacation, then you may want to have this form filled out and turned in just so everyone's aware of who has the ability to conduct business on behalf of your buyers. Any questions on the additional agent acknowledgement?
No, thank you.
Okay, fabulous. The next one, oh, hold on. We're going to skip down. I'm going to go find it because there's a second form linked into this one, which is our ABA form. It's our additional broker acknowledgement addendum. So that one was the first one was the AAA form, which is the additional agent acknowledgement for all agents working underneath the same brokerage. If for some reason you're sharing a transaction with another brokerage, like maybe oh, you've got a really fabulous Southern California agent who decided to have a listing in Vacaville, because that happens on occasion. And they don't want to refer the listing to you. They still want control because they have control issues. So they want to co-broker it with you, where you're going to do all the hands-on stuff. They're going to do all the paperwork or something, right? Something like that. And they're going to share the commission with you. That would be the additional broker acknowledgement. The other time I see this come into play sometimes is like under divorce situations where like the husband wants one agent to represent them in the sale of the property and the wife wants another agent. Sometimes we come together and we work together for the good of getting that house sold for the clients. But that would be different brokerages. So then we would use the ABA form, the additional broker acknowledgement addendum. You would fill this out. It's top section. It's a listing agreement. We were talking about the buyer representation agreement. So we'll talk about section 2. This is where you'd fill out broker 1 and broker 2. There's a box on the buyer representation agreement where you check that little box saying that, hey, we're working with 2 brokers here. And you could work the same. Both my examples were sellers. So if a buyer had a brother in Southern California, and the brother was just intent on doing all the paperwork for their brother purchasing a property in Vacaville, but they needed an agent locally to handle the showings and the letting inspectors in and all those things, they might work together. So that's where that would come into play. Is the compensation going to be split equally or X? Equally and jointly share responsibility, or how is the responsibility signed? And on the terms of the attached agreement. So you can have something attached as well, but that's where you'd fill out that information with regards to the buyer representation agreement. You would then again fill this out again, purchase agreement or other, when this was going to, when you're actually submitting the offer on the property, then you would check the box down here as well through B. Here's the brokers. You'd fill this section out. So you'd usually have two of these in a transaction if it's for a buyer or a seller. You're going to have one when you sign the buyer representation agreement filled out with section 2, and then one when you fill out the purchase agreement with section 3. Here's where you put the agent names, agent for broker 1 and agent for broker 2 with their license numbers. Activity under license of broker 1 or 2 or both is applicable to be conducted under multiple associate licensees, partners, or teams. So you can add this form with the AAA form. So let's say that I was being hired as broker 1 and I had a team of 2 agents that are both going to be working. Then I would have the ABA form. I would check this box to also include the last form, the AAA form, for additional licensees. If it's just you working on behalf of your brokerage and another agent working on behalf of their brokerage, then we just fill out 4 here and we don't check this box and we don't include the AAA form. And then everybody signs. Okay. And again here, if it's with the buyer representation agreement, it's going to be both brokerages sign and the buyer. If it's with the purchase agreement, it's going to be both brokerages, the buyer and the seller. And if it's a listing agreement, then it's going to be the listing brokerages and the seller for the first one. And then at time of offer, everybody would sign one as well. Questions on that additional broker acknowledgement?
No, thank you.
All right. We're going to pop back up now to our, yep, it's this one. Notice of broker involved properties. So super important. If we're going to cancel out our buyer representation agreement, or if our buyer representation agreement is expiring, it's coming to an end, either because we've agreed to mutually cancel and separate, or because it's just reached an expiration and we've decided we're not going to carry on in that client-agent relationship, then we want to make sure we provide a notice of broker involved properties. So the notice of broker involved properties is being provided to you as required in the written buyer representation agreement, dated. That's going to be the date in the upper left-hand corner of the first page of the BRBC. You're going to put in buyer's names. Oops. You're going to put in the broker's name. Let me scoot that back over. The representation period. When did it start and when does it expire? Okay, this is going to be whatever the current termination date is. Either we've canceled it and that termination date, or when it expires. Okay, we're going to put that date in there. So this is the furthest out date that we have. Compensation. Buyer has agreed to pay broker compensation provided for in the representation agreement for the property described in paragraph 2B of the representation agreement and for which there was broker involvement. Broker involved properties, and that's as follows. If buyer enters into a contract to acquire a broker involved property within the time specified or within the specified number of calendar days after the expiration of the representation period or any extension, and broker has provided to buyer a written list of broker involved properties in paragraph 4 prior to the expiration of the representation agreement, or if after cancellation of the representation agreement, buyer enters into contract. So right, that was the expiration. So before the expiration date, you need to provide this list of properties prior to the expiration date. But if there's a cancellation, If after cancellation of the representation agreement, buyer enters into a contract to acquire broker-involved property during the representation period, or if applicable, the specified number of days after the termination of the representation period, and broker has provided to buyer a written list of broker-involved properties 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation of the representation period. So for expiration, it needs to be before the expiration date. If we're canceling the agreement, it can be up to 5 days after the effective date of the cancellation. You provide this form. Here's where you would provide the list of properties that you've had broker involvement in. Or you can check a box down here and include a attached list. Okay. I highly recommend that you keep track of all the properties for every client for which you did some diligence on to be broker involved. So remember, broker involved is not just submitting, I've set them up for an automatic email from the MLS system or from my website, so they get notified of every property that matches the criteria. That doesn't count as broker involvement. It either has to be we saw the property, we wrote an offer on the property, I called the other agent, or I messaged the other agent to get more details about that property on behalf of the client. So we actually have to do some work for the property, not just send the emails notifications. Date of the notice of broker involved properties is being provided. You're going to put the date there. You're going to assign it here, and then buyer acknowledges they've received this list. And just keep in mind too that once the notice of broker involved properties has been delivered to you, this is to the buyer, it is effective even if the buyer chooses not to sign it. Okay.
Thank you. That was my question I was going to have.
Yeah, they don't have to sign it. Just like the cancellation of contract, they don't have to, somebody doesn't have to sign it. So
Okay.
there you go. Broker involved properties. Highly recommend you keep track of those properties as soon as you start working with a buyer. And then that brings us to our cancellation of buyer representation. So there's a special form for that. It's our COBRA form, COBR form. Here's where you put in the buyers or the broker's information, the buyer's names at the top, and then for the purpose of locating a real property or manufactured home pursuant to the written buyer or tenant representation period, that's the date. So I don't know why they did this one different than every other form in the car forms library and didn't put the date. Yeah, they just worded it weird. Anyways, this is the pre-printed date on the BRBC in the upper left-hand corner goes here. Notice for cancellation, the representation may be canceled by either buyer, tenant, or broker, or both by signing the applicable box below and delivering to the other party. However, compensation may still be owed based on the contractual rights of the representation agreement or otherwise. So 2A is noticed by signing in the applicable box below, buyer, tenant, that'd be if the buyer's canceling. If the broker's canceling, we check this box, or both are mutually canceling the agreement. Hereby gives notice to the other to cancel the representation and terminate their agency relationship duties and responsibilities and to with and to each other. Compensation may be payable as specified below. 2B, effective date of cancellation, defaults to a unilateral cancellation. Okay. So that would be if one party's canceling. So unilateral cancellation is one party, either the buyer or the brokers, it's canceling the agreement. Versus, so that's the default. 2 is mutual cancellation. So if we're both coming together, we've agreed that we are terminating this relationship, we would check the box for 2, that we are both agreeing we're done. So you're going to go either 1 or 2, and the default is 1. If we go with 1, then we have 2 options here. A is the representation agreement is for non-exclusive representation. The cancellation is effective immediately upon receipt or blank days after receipt of this notice. Okay, I'm instructing you guys that all of your BRBC should be exclusive representation. So for the most part, we're going to check box B, B1B. Representation agreement is for exclusive representation, and the cancellation is effective 30, or if a shorter time is allowed in the representation agreement, blank days after receipt of this notice. So based on The defaults in the BRBC under exclusive representation, any cancellation is effective 30 days after receipt of the cancellation if it's a unilateral cancellation. Now, you could decide to let them out. The buyer wants to cancel. You could decide to let them out sooner. You can see down here that we can tweak the compensation due. Okay. So you can check this box and change that day, but that's the default in the exclusive representation. Scope of cancellation is mutual cancellation we talked about already would be, we check this box here. And regardless of type of representation, if it's the mutual buyer and broker agree to mutually cancel the representation agreement immediately upon the last signature in the mutual cancellation box. Okay, so we can mutually cancel it. Scope of cancellation is C. The cancellation notice applies to all properties that are subject to the representation agreement, or this cancellation only applies for the following property. So why would we want just the following property? Because maybe the property the buyer decided to write an offer on was not offering broker compensation, and the buyer needed the seller to cover their portion of compensation to their agent, to you. And this property is not offering that, and you've said, hey, that's fine, you can write an offer on this property or you can accept that counter offer, but I'm no longer going to represent you in this purchase because I'm not going to work for free. Okay, if they can't pay you, they don't have the funds to pay you, seller's unwilling to pay that portion on buyer's behalf, then you could cancel it for just a specific property, which alleviates them of paying you compensation for that specific property. So we might have a mutual cancellation. Both are agreeing to the cancellation. It's mutual, and it applies for this specific property only. Otherwise, the default is that it's all properties covered under the representation agreement. The representation agreement, 2A, so right in line with this, it's only applying for the specific property. The representation agreement remains in effect for all other properties covered by the agreement. Or B, if checked, this unilateral cancellation is provided because the seller of the property identified in paragraph 2C2 above has declined to pay all of broker's compensation due from buyer, and buyer is represented that buyer lacks the ability to pay broker, see car form BRBC. Broker withdrawals from representing buyer for the property identified. Okay, so this could be me as the agent. The brokerage is canceling this agreement. Mutual cancellation just for this one property. And it's being provided because the buyer doesn't have the means to pay me and I'm not going to represent them for free. That's how that would get filled out there. Once cancellation becomes effective, broker will not be buyer or tenant's agent during any negotiation or transaction resulting between buyer and seller or housing provider. If buyer has any questions about the property to be acquired, leased, or rented, buyer should direct those questions to the seller housing provider's broker, if any, or to the seller or housing provider, or to any new broker buyer tenant retains, or to buyer tenant's own separate legal counsel. Compensation due to broker is E. Buyer or tenant agrees to pay broker as specified in the written agreement between them. That's car forms BRBC or the PSRA. Provide that in the event of cancellation, broker should be entitled to compensation for the properties for which there was broker involvement, if any such properties acquired during the representation period, and if applicable during the continuation period. So we talked about that last week. You can go back and watch that lesson for clarification on the continuation period. Specified in the applicable representation agreement, broker shall give buyer tenant a list of such properties within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the representation agreement. Compensation, that's 1. So that would be the first option, which is the default is, hey, if you enter into contract on any properties in the representation period or the continuation for which there was broker involvement, I'm due a commission. 2 is compensation shall be paid as specified below if both parties agree by signing the mutual cancellation below. Expenses incurred, buyer agrees to pay broker flat rate for out-of-pocket expenses, costs incurred, and services rendered to buyer prior to the effective date of the cancellation and of the buyer representation agreement, right? That would be kind of like a cancellation fee. Expenses incurred. We're saying, hey, you got to cover the expenses that I've incurred. I'm not sure. Oh, it's timing out. Don't time out. All right. Broker to receive a referral fee. Broker will receive a referral fee from another broker pursuant to a separate written agreement between broker and other broker. So, hey, I'm letting you off the hook because you've decided to purchase outside of my area of expertise, my service area. I'm referring you to another broker. I'm canceling this, but I'm going to get a referral fee from whatever broker you end up using, would be the goal. But you need to have an agreement with that other broker. No compensation. So maybe we're just like, hey, I don't want, like, I'm done with you, buyer. I don't want anything to do with you. Please don't, I don't want to ever hear your name again. Like, we're done. I'm canceling this. You're a pain in my butt. We're done. No compensation. Or other is line C. So you're going to can choose one of those as well if both parties are agreeing to. This is basically, this is the idea behind E2 is that we are modifying the compensation that was in the BRBC. So the default is your whatever's due to me as the BRBC for broker involved properties. That's what you're going to pay me. Section 2 down here is something where we're changing what would be due. Either, hey, I'm letting you off ahead of time or outside of the continuation period, but you've got to pay me for my expenses incurred or getting a referral fee or, hey, we're done. There's no compensation due. Buyer to obtain other advice. You should reach out to, real estate, legal, tax, title, insurance, or other desired advice from qualified real estate professional. This is mutual cancellation. This is unilateral cancellation. So the first box is if everybody's in agreement, we're all going to sign, then we sign box 1. Or if I'm canceling on my buyer or my buyer's canceling on me, then just the buyer would sign here. The other party can acknowledge receipt down here. But you don't have to have the other party's signature for the cancellation to be valid. Any questions on that cancellation of the buyer representation agreement?
No, thank you.
Fabulous. All right, let's see. We've got a little bit more time. There was that ABA form. Let's see what else we've got today. Oh, I was going to talk about this additional signature addendum. That might be the last form that I have for today. Fabulous. I did really good. All right. Additional signature addendum on our buyer representation agreement, just like up here on this cancellation. You'll see here that we have, this was the additional broker acknowledgement. It doesn't matter. All the forms are the same. There's like 2 seller lines and 2 buyer lines. So what happens if we've got 4 buyers or 3 buyers, right? So what happens if we have more than 2 buyers? We use an additional signature addendum form, an ASA form. There is a box on the purchase agreement or on the buyer representation agreement that you would check if there's more than 2 buyers. This form here, it's not an assignment. It's not going to be used to add new parties to a contract that was previously formed. We would use the AOAA form for that. This addendum is just used with multiple forms as long as forms are prepared and dated at the same time. Okay, so these are like we've got more than 2 buyers. They would sign this form at the same time that like the purchase agreement or the BRBC is signed at the same time. Okay, so here we're going to put the persons or entities identified in paragraph 3 are additional signatories to the form identified in paragraph 2, dated blank. So we would put the date in there of which that form was dated. For the property known as, you're going to put in the full property address there. And then here is where you're going to put in buyers' names. Okay. And then, well, okay. So let's say that there's 3 buyers and it's between, we're doing the BRBC, we would check the box for buyer, and then down here would be the box for broker. So this is where we would put Realty One Group Fox or your brokerage name. And then up here, we would list the buyer's names. Okay, so buyer's names up here because we checked the box, and then broker's names. When we go to write an offer, it would be buyer and seller. Okay, so we can change how this form is used depending on the forms that are attached to it. So purchase. Let's go here. Buyer representation. The buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship, buyer's investigation advisory, broker compensation advisory, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent, and the California Consumer Privacy Act disclosure. And notice they made this form really simple for you. This used to be really complicated because it just had blank lines. But now they're saying, hey, if you're doing buyer representation, these are all the documents attached to that BRBC form. Okay, so it lists them all there. Now you could also check others because maybe we're signing more forms. Maybe we're also signing like the SBSA form at the same time, the market conditions advisory form. Maybe we have our BFPI form, our buyer financial buyer. I don't remember the name of it, but I know it's BFPI or the BIPP form. Um, Maybe we're signing, who knows what else is in there, but whatever's being signed on this date at this time, we're going to put it in these boxes. So if we can encompass it in one of these boxes, either by the purchase agreement, the listing agreement, rental buyer representation, or there's also transfer disclosure statement here and seller property questionnaire. So we can check any of these boxes for whatever forms are being signed and then fill in any additional ones down here. And you can use the acronyms. You don't have to spell them all out. By signing below, the undersigned acknowledge receipt of the documents identified above, and if applicable, liquidated damage and arbitration, additional signature addendum attached, and agrees to the terms, conditions, representations, disclosures in the document. Whew. So here's our additional. So if we have 3 buyers, we would put the third buyer here. Buyer 1 and 2 are going to sign the buyer representation agreement on the signature lines provided on that form. Buyer 3 signs this form. If we had 4 buyers, then we'd be buyer and buyer 4 signs this form. Okay. I have had a transaction with a listing with 5 sellers. Super fun. All right. Now, you would also, so that's for the buyer representation agreement, right? Whatever's being signed. If it was the purchase, so we were doing a offer that needed to be signed and checking this box, we would want to include the LDAA form. It says attached. It's not actually attached. So we would want to go back into our forms library. We would go into add. We're going to go forms library here. And that was our liquidated damage LDAA. Add. Okay, we only have to add this in the case of a purchase agreement because as part of the purchase agreement is the liquidated damage and the arbitration agreement that's inside of that. And so here we would, the liquidated damage, if we agreed, if all parties are signing that, the buyer 3 and buyer 4 would initial here. And then they would initial here for the arbitration agreement. And then they would initial the bottom page for acknowledge of receipt. Okay. So buyer 3 and buyer 4, buyer 3 and buyer 4, and buyer 3 and 4 up here at the top. So there's 3 places that they would initial just this form, just like on the purchase offer. There's 3 places on that page that they initial that they are in agreement. So that is our ASA. We only have to worry about this additional form if it's the purchase, if it's the buyer representation agreement. We don't have to worry about that additional form. It would just be this one. We're going to outline all the documents being signed, and then they're going to sign here. Now, anytime documents are signed, we're going to come back to this form. I like to use the same form personally and just update it because all the buyers' names are already going to be in there because we're already going to have up here, we're going to have buyer 1, buyer 2, buyer 3, buyer 4. It's all going to be listed at the top. Okay. But now we're in contract. We're signing forms. We're doing, if you were going to do even to the buyer representation agreement, maybe we were doing an extension. So we're doing the modification of terms. we're going to come in here. I like to keep this. We're going to update the date. So maybe this was, being done a different day. So now all the documents were signed yesterday. Now we're doing something different. We would put in the new date here, leave everything else the same, uncheck the box. I'm going to come down here and say, hey, we're just doing a modification of terms. So that would be an MT-BR. So we would just put the new forms that we're signing down here, and then they would re-sign this form with the new set of documents. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So anytime you got more than two clients, because there's only two lines on all the forms, we would go with an additional signature addendum, an ASA form. And to make it even more confusing, if we were adding a buyer to the contract, maybe we had two buyers and the house they found they wanted, they now need a co-signer, we would use an AOAA form, which I'm not going to go over today, but that's the assignment of agreement to add the third buyer to that transaction. And then they would have to go back and initial all the pages of the previous documents. And then we would use this form moving forward from the time that we added that buyer onto the contract. And in fact, we would use it for the AOA form as well. Anyways, there you go. Now you're really confused. That's all I got for you today. Next week, it's straight up 10 o'clock. I did really, really good. I didn't think I was going to get through all those. Next week, we're going to start diving into, I should be able to get access, and we'll dive into all the new forms changes that are coming out at the end of the month. So join us next week for the forms changes, the June 2026 forms library changes.
Fantastic. Hey, Amy, so if we are working with the TC in our office, will they help you to make sure that you have all these forms in place? Is that what the TC does, or is this something that we have to make sure we're doing ourselves, which is just fine too?
Yeah. Generally speaking, your TC will help you make sure you have all the forms. However, that being said, oftentimes, like our broker agreement or a listing agreement gets signed before we involve our transaction coordinator into the transaction. So
Yes.
you do need to know about like the ABA forms or the AAAs or the additional signatures in case on that buyer representation agreement you do have more than two buyers signing that document, or there's another brokerage involved or more than one agent, then we want to have all those done at the same time. So you do kind of need to have a basic understanding, and you can always pull your TC in. So you can always be like, hey, okay, I've got some buyers. I'm getting ready to send them that buyer representation agreement, but there's three of them. What other forms do I need, TC? And they should be able to answer those questions for you.
Thank you. Okay, great. Perfect.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thanks for
Awesome.
joining
We'll
me
see you
today.
next week. Thank
All right.
you.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.